Hi everyone. We're going to talk about chapter 19 now. And so we started the book with Jennifer, and now we're going to end with her story as well. When she got the news clipping from Ron about Bobby Poole's death, this is what she had to say. It actually made me sad that at the end of this man's life, all that could be written about him was that he was an inmate at Central Prison who had died of cancer at UNC Chapel Hill Hospital. Maybe I felt something like compassion, something I could only feel because I was a mother now. Bobby Poole had been somebody's baby once. What had happened in his life? Who was he? Sometimes I still woke from sleep with the face haunting me, but the face was scrubbed of features. So now she's kind of not remembering a specific face during that time, and she's doing what I had talked about at the end of the video for chapter 18, wanting to know his story, but unfortunately I don't think we will get to hear that. She ends up volunteering for SCAN, Stop Child Abuse Now. She is a lay therapist, which means she's a kind of parent aide trained to go into the homes of high-risk families who had either been court-ordered to participate in the program or had taken it upon themselves to reach out for help. I signed on with families for 2 or 3 years trying to reparent the parents, help the parents learn different techniques of coping with their children, ways to discipline them that weren't emotionally or physically injuring. It was extremely difficult. At times, the family situations I walked into were incredibly dysfunctional. But what I saw completely knocked me from my moral high ground. It was way too easy, before I started working with those families, to judge them. It became very clear that parents who abuse their kids have been abused themselves. They were carrying the pain. I worked with SCAN for about 4 years. It helped me to stop seeing Bobby Poole as simply evil. In my gut, I felt that someone somewhere had failed him. So his death, while it marked an end for both Ron and myself, made me sad. But at the same time, it wasn't fair that he had gotten off this easy. Bobby Poole owed me, and he owed Ron, and he owed all the other women he had hurt. I picked up the phone and called Ron, the only other person who would understand the conflicting emotions I felt over Poole's death. And so they talk, and she gets to eventually meet Raven, his daughter. Um, and she has said, and it might be kind of here in the book and in other interviews, that, if she hadn't picked Ron, Raven might not exist. I mean, think about that. We don't know what Ron's life would have been like if he hadn't been picked and wrongfully convicted. Um, and when she talks to audiences about everything, she says, "It pained me to describe Ron as I had once thought of him. For so many years, the police officers and the prosecutors told me I was the best witness they ever put on the stand. I was textbook. My words had condemned Ronald, but I could only hope now every time I spoke they could celebrate and honor him and maybe, just maybe, help to change the system to make sure when our children grew up, mistakes like this wouldn't be made." And she is invited to a conference in Texas. They are covering the case of Gary Graham, who is to be executed. And she tells them, she's like, "I warned them, I am a huge supporter of the death penalty." Which you might think, well, really? After everything you went through? Um, but at the end of this visit, I think she definitely changes her mind on it. She says, "Naively, I had believed that if someone was sentenced to death, there could be no doubt about that person's guilt." Remember, she also naively thought when she was given a lineup that they must have already had the real guy in there. She says, "I had seen my rapist for nearly a half an hour. His face had been inches from me, and yet I was completely wrong." She wonders, in this case, what if this eyewitness made a deadly error? And so one night she goes with the whole group out to dinner, and she finds out that all of them are wrongfully convicted. And they're introducing themselves. And so she's asked to introduce herself. And she says, "I told them with no small degree of shame that, like many of them, an innocent man named Ronald Cotton had lost 11 years of his life after I mistakenly identified him. I'm sorry," I told them, "although I had nothing to do with their cases." The next day at the press conference, I openly wept and begged for clemency for Graham. But she still feels this burden that she's carrying. "I still had a hard time forgiving myself for being less than perfect. The mistake I made had impacted people's lives for years, and I felt it was my burden to carry." And so there's this professor out of Iowa State University, Gary Wells. He did a presentation about memory and eyewitness identification. It really floored me. For the first time I understood how memory could be contaminated because of the way eyewitness evidence had been collected. The professor said eyewitnesses will often pick the next best one if the right person isn't in the lineup. Picking the wrong man had not been simply my personal failure, but a human error that many people had made and would continue to make. One innovation he talked about was double-blind testing, where the law enforcement officer showing a lineup, like the witness, had no idea who the suspect is and therefore can't give any verbal or nonverbal clues as to whether you've picked the right person. So what does that mean in Jennifer's case? All those years ago, Mike was doing his job by the book, but when I asked him if I did okay and he told me yes, then I subconsciously tried to pick the same person out of the physical lineup. So remember, Mike, he did his job. That's what they were teaching officers to do then. But you're not supposed to, what we have found is it's better not to have the person on the case, the police officer, with the witness when they're trying to make an identification. And so then when she goes to the lineup, she's not trying to pick the guy in the lineup who looked like the rapist. She's trying to pick the guy from the photo lineup. And so she says, Ron was the only person who had been in both the photo and the physical lineups, making his face more familiar to me. And then the police told me I had identified the same person in the physical lineup whose photo I had selected. So by the time I went into court, everything added up for me. I was defiantly confident that Ronald Cotton was the one. My memory of the night, while valid and visceral, was not like a VCR recording I could play at will. Seeing Ronald Cotton's face in the lineup and in court meant that his face eventually just replaced the original image of my attacker. In the law books, they call it unconscious transference. In layman's terms, my memory had been contaminated. Later, when I looked at the composite we created and at a mugshot of Poole, I thought I had actually done a great job. The problem was that Bobby Poole had not been in my lineup. Ronald Cotton had, and at the time, Ronald Cotton most resembled that composite. The standard way eyewitness evidence was collected had failed me, and because of that, I'd failed too. And so Ron and Jennifer, they will visit when they can, and he tells her that he ran into Mary Reynolds. They were in the mall. He and Raven were in the mall. They were getting a cookie, and she was behind the counter. And Ronald says she just had this stunned look on her face, like she was seeing a ghost or something. She had aged some. She had on different glasses than what she wore in court all those years ago, but it was her. She handed me the cookie all wrapped in wax paper, and I paid my $1 and some change. Jennifer asked, "Did you say anything?" "No, I just paid and walked away." "Did she say anything?" "Just thank you when I paid." Jennifer says, "I knew that if I had never picked Ron, Mary would have never picked him either." I told Ron that I thought about Mary often, almost every time I went to speak, because almost everywhere I went, there were women in the audience who have been raped. Some of them I can spot from a mile away. And she ends up talking to one of those after talk she gave at a church. And the lady says, "I've never really been able to move forward. I have a lot of difficulty accepting love, but the hardest thing is I just can't forgive myself." And Jennifer asks, "What do you mean? Why do you need to forgive yourself?" The lady said, "I must have done something to deserve it. I must have been an awful child or something, or God wouldn't have punished me like this." And Jennifer asks her, "Who told you that? Why would you think that?" And the woman says, "Because God punishes the sinful. I must have been being punished." And Jennifer says, "You must not be praying to my God. My God would never punish anyone in that way, especially not a child. Nothing you did made you deserve that. Nothing." And Jennifer then wonders about how many women still feel that way. And even if a sexual assault victim gets the opportunity to prosecute, the defense asks questions like, "Were you drinking? What time were you out?" No wonder so many women do not prosecute, with their lives opened up like wounds. For some, the only way is to bury it. They do their best to pretend it never happened. And I want to bring up something that recently has kind of been making the rounds on social media. And these are quotes specifically from judges who had to preside over cases of rape. And these are things that judges, real judges, have said. So think about, okay, why do people not come forward? Maybe this is why. So Judge Raymond Dean, he's addressing a jury in a rape trial. So the jury, the people who decide guilt or innocence, this is what he told them. As the gentlemen on the jury will understand, all men on a jury now for a rape trial. He says, when a woman says no, she doesn't always mean it. Men can't turn their emotions on and off like a tap like some women can. Judge Gabriel Hutton, speaking to a guilty rapist, he tells the rapist, I hope you'll be able to keep your well-paid job and the couple of weeks you spend in prison will be treated by the employers as part of your holidays. Same judge, talking about an 8-year-old girl who had been sexually abused for a year by a convicted child molester. He says, it seems on the evidence that this child has not suffered as a result of these offenses. Again, Judge Hutton, talking to a man who got 2 years probation. A man who sexually assaulted a 9-year-old boy needed a chance to get over his problems. Sir Kenneth Jupp, a judge who gave a man a 2-year suspended sentence for raping his ex-wife. This was a rare sort of rape. It is not like someone being jumped on in the street. This is within the family and does not impinge on the public. Judge Arthur Meyerson, praising a rapist for wearing a condom. The rapist was given a lighter sentence of 3 years. He tells the rapist, you showed concern and consideration by wearing a contraceptive. Judge Derek Johnson, this was in 2008. If someone doesn't want to have sexual intercourse, the body shuts down. The body will not permit that to happen unless a lot of damage is inflicted. The victim in this case, although she wasn't necessarily willing, she didn't put up a fight. The body doesn't shut down. Judge Greg Lenin in 2017. Clearly a drunk can consent. No, they can't. Judge Robin Camp, 2016. Why couldn't you just keep your knees together? Why didn't you just sink your bottom down into the basin so he couldn't penetrate you? Pain and sex sometimes go together. And then another judge in 2017. She had admitted that she used to do all dirty things. It appears that she was inherently abnormal and had sexual instincts from her childhood, whatever that means. So, when you have judges like this in the current time, it's not surprising that people don't come forward then. And that's just judges. Prosecutors have said things. Police officers have said things. And those things keep people from coming forward. Especially if you are a person who has been violated and raped by a police officer, who do you go to? We have a culture in our police precincts where they back everybody up. They back each other up. Police officers do that, even if they've committed a crime. And that's the problem that we have with this police culture. It is demeaning, it is violent, and it's covering up for people who should really be in prison themselves. So she goes on in our book. Jennifer says that Ron and her talk. And in one conversation, as they're saying goodbye, he tells her, I love you. And she says, I love you too. And her teenage kids are there and they say, it was difficult to explain to teenagers how strange life could be. Ron and I would always be connected by what had happened, and after all this time, to say we were friends just wasn't enough. Alright, I'm just about out of time for this video, so I will finish up the last few things for this chapter in video number 2 for chapter 19.